to speak on a separate topic and that it be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, you were there yesterday. The Senate Judiciary Committee met. I chair that committee, and we had a strong turnout of Democrats and Republicans to consider an issue which everyone's read about or heard about over the last several weeks, and that is the ethical standards applied at the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court across the street. We've all read the news stories that led to this hearing. Questions raised about one particular justice, but not him alone, in terms of gifts that they've received and whether it influences their decision-making on the court. That is basic and fundamental. If you think the fix is in on a court, you don't have much respect for their operation. So the question is, what's going on in the Supreme Court? And as it turns out, as you well know, we have ethical standards all across the federal government that apply to the members of the Senate and the House, the executive branch, and to all of the courts below the Supreme Court in terms of financial disclosure and basic rules of the road of what you can do and what you can't do. For example, there's a basic standard that is used for gifts for members of the Senate and House that puts a limit of $50 on the value of any gift. I have returned gifts given to me, which I thought exceeded that value. I'm sure the presiding officer has as well. But that's our standard. There's no such standard, as best we can understand, when it comes to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. So it turns out the highest court in the land has some of the lowest ethical standards. Why? Well, when this came to light in the news articles about Justice Thomas, I wrote to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, and invited him to come to the hearing yesterday to tell his side of the story. What is the Supreme Court doing when it comes to ethical standards? They don't play by the same rules as all the other courts in America. What are their standards? Well, the Chief Justice declined my invitation and sent along some documents to indicate what he thinks are the rules of the road for ethics in the Supreme Court now. They were interesting, but unfortunately, they revealed that the standards at the highest court in the land are not even equal to the standards at all the other federal courts. So we had a hearing yesterday on the subject, and we invited witnesses from the Republican side and the Democratic side to comment on the current state of affairs. If the Chief Justice couldn't appear or would not appear, we went forward with the investigation, which is our responsibility under the law. Now, asking a justice of the Supreme Court to come and testify before a congressional committee is not unusual. 92 appearances have been made by justices on the Supreme Court since 1960 before the committees of Congress. But yesterday, the Chief Justice, nor any other member of the justice on the Supreme Court, appeared before us. So what we found was a surprise to me. I thought there would be some bipartisanship to this, because in not too distant past, two senators on the committee had crafted an ethics bill on the disclosure of stock holdings, sent it not only to the president to sign, but it was embraced as well by the Supreme Court. A bipartisan, thoughtful measure for sure. But yesterday, I'm afraid things were very partisan. First, there was a question as to whether or not this was an attempt to attack the conservative members of the Supreme Court by raising ethical questions. I tried to make a point several times that the first letter that I sent to a Chief Justice, this Chief Justice, on the issue of Code of Ethics for the Supreme Court, I delivered on February the 13th, 2012, during the Obama administration. So this was not some newfound interest. I've been working on it for years. My colleague, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, also has dedicated a major part of his Senate career to this issue of ethical standards before the Supreme Court. So the notion that we just invented this because of unhappiness with a recent court decision just doesn't hold up. Many of us have been working on this issue for years before any of these decisions were handed down. There was also an argument that Congress has no authority to establish standards for the Supreme Court. As I mentioned earlier, when we had the stock disclosure law passed last year, it was embraced by the court. The court goes through some form of financial disclosure based on a law passed in 1978. And by and large, there are many ways that the Congress interfaces with the Supreme Court, not the least of which is its budget. So we're in constant communication with the court and its operation. I believe that we clearly have the authority to establish ethical standards in law for the Supreme Court. The Republicans, to a person, disagreed with it. We also had an argument made that somehow we had singled out Clarence Thomas, a justice on the Supreme Court, and decided that he was going to be persecuted by this type of inquiry. Well, let me say the facts that were disclosed about his gift-taking from a Texas billionaire were extraordinary. I think they were a surprise to most people. Justice Thomas has not denied the fact that he took hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of vacations, yacht trips to Indonesia, private aircraft, from this Texas billionaire. He dismissed it and said that it was personal hospitality. Personal hospitality does not include transportation. And of course, this included a lot of the most luxurious transportation imaginable that the justice received. So to say that this was acceptable conduct, it clearly was to the Republicans yesterday, but I think most Americans want to know a little bit more about the relationship that would lead a justice to take hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of trip, not to mention that the same billionaire bought his mother's home and allowed her to live there afterwards. And so that was worth at least $140,000 to the benefit of the justice's family again. There were questions raised throughout as to why we would pick on one conservative justice. I will tell you the disclosures that have come out since the Thomas article about the gifts he's received from the Texas billionaire have included many members of the court, certainly those who wouldn't be put in the conservative category. Questions have been raised. Questions are raised about members of Congress all the time, and they should be. I know each year when I disclose my taxes and my net worth in detail, somebody's going to call with a question. Explain this item to me. Explain that item to me. That is part of the responsibility of public service. It's no fun, but it's part of the job. If you want to be a public figure, I think you owe it to the people to be assuring them at every step of the way that you're being honest about discharging your duties. So we haven't given up. When it comes to the Senate Judiciary Committee and the issue of ethics, we're far from finished. We had good testimony yesterday from witnesses that I think give us a basis for moving forward in this area. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that people, as skeptical as they are of politicians, with they have every right to be, believe that the institutions, whether it's Congress or the Supreme Court or the President's office, are at least credible and trustworthy. Establishing a fundamental ethical standard that assures that fact is absolutely essential, and the Senate Judiciary Committee will continue that pursuit. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call a roll.
Ms. Baldwin.